Until the 1950s, Britain sported the world's most successful motorbike industry, accounting for sales that spread to nearly all corners of the globe through such venerable names as Triumph, BSA, Norton and Vincent, but by the turn of 1970 was facing an almost complete collapse as foreign competition, together with low investment in antiquated building facilities, saw what had once been the dominant power for two-wheeled motorised transport be swept aside in a vein similar to the wider British car industry. Much like the car builders, the British motorbike industry has its roots going back to the very beginning of motorised two-wheel transport, when in 1884, the first commercial design for a self-propelled bicycle was invented by Englishman Edward Butler, with the Butler petrol cycle being a three-wheeled model that was powered by a 600cc engine that generated 0.6 horsepower, making its public debut at the 1885 International Inventions Exhibition in London, but failed to garner the commercial success necessary to allow Butler to put the machine into full-scale production. The first motorbike models to be sold in widespread numbers were the products of Germany, such as 1894's Hildebrand and Wolfmuller Motorrad, though Britain would gain notoriety during 1896, when the Coventry-based Excelsior Motor Company began the production of the first publicly available motorcycle, followed 5 years later in 1901 by Royal Enfield producing their first motorcycle, which came complete with a 239cc engine that drove the rear wheel using a belt, followed a year later by Norton, and in 1910 by the British Small Arms Company or BSA. Another major player in the world of motorbikes would be Triumph, who had been working on their first motorcycle since 1898, and began producing them from 1902. Their ability to assemble sturdy designs effectively, leading rapidly to them becoming the world's largest motorcycle manufacturer by 1903, with a production rate of 500 units per annum, their first major goal being the creation of the Triumph Model H or Trusty Triumph of 1915. This would be widely regarded as the world's first modern motorcycle, and was built with a 3-speed gearbox and belt transmission, this 550cc model illustrating design characteristics that would set the direction for motorbike assembly going into the future, with 1924 seeing the British motorbike industry setting records in productivity and sales output that left rival nations far behind. This was further exemplified through the prestige of the Chater Lee Company, who, from their purpose-built 5-storey factory in London, created the first 350cc motorcycle to exceed 100 miles an hour, with machines that would later find racing fame in the Isle of Man TT, and by 1930 Britain would have over 80 different home-based manufacturers, while the equivalent United States sported only 2 motorbike builders for 22 years, Indian and Harley-Davidson, the rivalry of which would eventually come to an end in 1953, when Indian closed their factory in Springfield, Massachusetts, and Royal Enfield took control of the brand. World War II was truly the boom years for motorbike production, with all of Britain's builders being pressed into service so as to create scout bikes and high-speed couriers for the armed forces, including their use as dispatch riders from the famous Bletchley Park Code-Breaking Centre in Buckinghamshire, who employed these riders to transfer signal intercepts to and from the facility at the fastest possible speed, taking the highest priority over all other road traffic, but being an exceptionally dangerous job due to the winding, dark and uneven surfaces of Britain's road network at the time. Royal Enfield's contribution was particularly notable, as they provided a 125cc lightweight model that could be dropped from an aircraft and land safely in its parachute-fitted tube cage, this model being officially titled the Royal Enfield WDRE, but was more commonly known among its peers as the Flying Flea. With the end of the war and the cultural impact the motorbike had through its heroic appearances in nearly all of its theatres, leading to this once utilitarian mode of easy transport becoming an icon of 1950s motoring. Initially, surplus wartime bikes and brand new models provided a cheaper alternative to cars for the working classes, as not only did they cost less to buy, they also came with the advantage of a £50 reduction in road tax charges when compared to a four-wheeled vehicle, though by the mid-1950s, as the newly liberated teenage demographic became a fixture of Western culture, the motorbike provided an exciting form of transportation, and by extension freedom from the inner city and suburban living. This was signified in the 1953 film The Wild One, a milestone of 1950s cinema starring Marlon Brando, whose pride and joy is a 1950 Triumph Thunderbird 6T, with the huge commercial success and rebel image of The Wild One not only seeing a major commercial uplift for Triumph motorcycles, but also saw motorbike troops and gangs quickly emerging, such as the Ton-Up Boys, Cafe Racers, the Rockers and the Mods, groups of thrill-seekers with looks mimicking Brando who would often combine elements from different motorbike models, such as the engines from Triumphs and the frames from Nortons, to create road-going monsters capable of over 100 miles an hour. In the realm of racing, British motorbikes led the charge, the first being in 1949 with the 500cc World Championship of that year, when Leslie Graham from Merseyside won the competition, this trend continuing into the 1950s, with Jeff Duke from Lancashire earning both the 350cc and 500cc World Championship titles in 1951, another 350cc class win in 1952, and 3 consecutive 500cc titles between 1953 and 1955, as well as 6 Isle of Man TT races that set new lap records. By 1951, while there were dozens of individual motorbike companies, including the likes of Vincent and its famous Black Shadow, which, with its 110-mile-an-hour top speed, was the fastest production bike in the world upon its launch in 1948, the most significant 3 companies of the British motorbike scene were Triumph, Birmingham Small Arms or BSA, and Norton, each of these 3 firms illustrating distinct traits that made them adored both in the UK and internationally, Triumph holding a glamorous image, Norton being the backbone of Britain's racing prowess, and BSA possessing huge production outputs and sales volumes that, contrary to its somewhat mundane image, took the global market by storm. However, during that same year, and so as to ostensibly avoid death duties, Triumph's owner, Jack Sangster, sold the motorbike company to BSA for a tidy sum of £2.5 million, which proved to be a superb return on investment from his original purchase of the financially struggling company back in 1936 for a mere £50,000, thanks to having revolutionised the firm under his tenure with the likes of the Triumph Speed Twin, thanks largely to the assistance of Edward Turner of Ariel, who was brought in to improve the builder's image. This would make Triumph one of the most sought-after brands of motorbike in the world, as reflected in its substantial profits, which, following its purchase, were often diverted into BSA's own books, as while the mass-production builder outsold Triumph greatly, it had far narrower margins of profit due to an aggressive pricing strategy that sought to undercut any perceived competition, BSA also acquiring from Sangster the Ariel, Sunbeam and New Hudson companies. At the same time, Norton, though hugely successful in creating racing bikes, had fallen into financial difficulty following the introduction of the featherbed frame, as developed by the McCandless brothers of Belfast in January 1950, and was used in the legendary Manx Norton and raced by riders including Jeff Duke, John Surtees and Derek Minter, the featherbed frame allowing for the construction of a motorcycle with good mass stiffness distribution, and quickly became the benchmark by which all other frames were judged. Unfortunately, due to the expense of developing the featherbed, and the company's inability to produce this complex design in a manner that would satisfy customer demand, potential clients rapidly dropped away, as they showed little interest in purchasing bikes with older frames when compared to the revolutionary new design, forcing the company to be sold in 1953 to Associated Motorcycles or AMC, who owned the brands HAS, Matchless, Francis Barnett and James, followed in 1962 by the original Norton factory at Bracebridge Street in Birmingham being closed, and production moved to AMC's Woolwich factory in southeast London. However, while Britain was the dominant force in motorbike building during the 1950s, it was no longer alone in this field, as rapidly coming up behind to steal away sales were the manufacturers of what had been considered destroyed enemies at the end of World War II, Italy and Japan, both nations, which had seen their industrial might devastated during the conflict, having a clean slate upon which they could produce a far more efficient and streamlined production system than what had come before, far outdoing the likes of BSA and AMC when considering their own antiquated facilities in the UK. The most prominent of the foreign builders emerged in the form of Honda, who released the Super Cub 4-stroke motorcycle in 1958 and climbed the sales charts in such a meteoric manner that, by 1959, BSA's market share of 1 in 4 motorbikes globally had been swept aside by their new Japanese opponent. This was a fact that British management were not unaware of, as in 1960, Edward Turner of Triumph travelled to Japan to see for himself the extent of the threat the likes of Honda, Suzuki and Yamaha posed, to which he was treated with the highest respect by the Japanese engineers as a figurehead of the British industry, and he too was impressed by Japan's leaps and bounds in the development of simple, sturdy motorbikes. However, upon writing a report on his findings, it was evident that he had either not recognised or failed to act upon many crucial signs that showed how Honda, Suzuki and alike were able to produce 500,000 motorcycles a year as compared to the 140,000 in England, with even Honda alone providing a production rate that far exceeded the cumulative UK industry. The truth was that Japan was investing huge sums of money where it counted, primarily in forward development, with Honda sporting a team of 400 technicians who worked around the clock to develop methods in design and assembly improvement, that would speed up production without sacrificing their product's innate mechanical fidelity, while at the same time creating up-to-date factories and plant machinery that meant production rates could easily outstrip what was found at the comparatively outdated British workshops. Turner's conclusion at the time was that while the export market may be threatened, the British domestic market was firmly secure, despite the fact that the UK government had opened up the trade doors to motorcycle imports from Japan, while Japan had made no such concessions. Turner's beliefs were motivated by the fact that there was no real imperative to sell British motorbikes on the Japanese market, due to the large price difference, while the recent release of the highly successful Triumph Bonneville gave the British management the impression that the UK motorbike industry could remain competitive going forward without any real need for improvement or change. This was compounded further by the notion among British managers that, because the Japanese were engaged in building small-capacity motorbikes, there was no indication early on that they would move to create larger engine machines, with their mindset being that small Japanese motorbikes would essentially complement the British models by way of introducing future customers to the experience of motorcycling, before ultimately transitioning to larger bikes as produced by UK firms. This belief, though, was completely misled, as once the Japanese firms began investing into the large bike market, they rapidly swept the competition aside with a plethora of modern, efficient and reliable machines that made the products of Triumph, BSA and alike look pedestrian by comparison. British bikes being notorious for their aged underpinnings, temperamental mechanics and their propensity to leak oil, with even the latest designs from the British industry, such as the Triumph Trident and BSA Rocket 3, being exceptionally rushed models that were forced through development and into production by an impatient management, thus leading to no end of teething problems. This wasn't helped by the fact that what was meant to be an exercise in badge engineering between the two versions ended up being a costly duplication due to differences in the way the engines were assembled for the Trident and the Rocket 3. The time taken for BSA and Triumph to iron out these faults, meaning customers grew rapidly dismissive of the domestic builders once they had tasted the smooth-running, reliable and fast Honda CB750, and later the Kawasaki Z1, not to mention smaller capacity models that lost almost nothing to the large British twins in terms of performance, comfort and mechanical fidelity. The truth was that, aside from misreading the signs that heralded the impending rise of the Japanese as a viable competitor, the market for motorbikes had largely disappeared by the middle of the 1960s, thus leading to BSA, Triumph and AMC, the latter of which had been acquired by BSA in 1966, to be the only major players left in the game, their flourishing sales among working-class buyers immediately after World War II having been cast aside by the arrival of economy cars such as the Austin Mini, the Ford Anglia and the Hillman Imp. Further competition also came in the form of the glass fibre Reliant Regal and later Reliant Robin three-wheelers of Tamworth, with the lack of a fourth wheel meaning these cars could exploit a loophole in the UK car tax system that meant they were technically considered motor-trikes, and thus cost less to run, the Reliant firm climbing the sales charts with such aplomb that by 1975 it had become Britain's second largest car firm behind British Leyland. The sheer collapse of motorbike sales in the UK was illustrated in that, by 1950, 761,500 two-wheeled motorised vehicles had been registered in Britain against 2.3 million cars, while by 1968 the number of two-wheeled vehicles registered had jumped to only 1.34 million, while cars had shot upward to 11 million. Combined also with a general drop in productivity, with assembly rates over the same period falling from 171,300 motorcycles built to 84,000, while bike imports had jumped from practically zero in 1950 to 111,700 by 1968. This isn't to say that motorbike sales globally were dying, as there was still a strong demand for larger capacity bicycles in the United States and Canada, while developing countries and the Commonwealth relied heavily on motorbikes for everyday transportation and the conveyance of goods, essentially the equivalent of delivery trucks, but neither of these factors could compensate for the fact that the models presented by the British motorbike industry were outdated and unreliable. Attempts to fight back onto the stage of small-engine motorcycles by BSA were again mired in disjointed and disastrous development, as was the case with the Ariel 3, which was launched in June 1970 as a revival of the dormant, though largely unrecognised Ariel brand that was the intellectual property of BSA, the Ariel 3 being a three-wheeled moped with an automatic transmission, but proved to be a monumental failure upon its release. The Ariel 3's 50cc fan-cooled single-cylinder two-stroke engine, made by Dutch company Anker, had not been built to accommodate fan cooling, and thus could only intake air when the bike was actually moving, meaning that, if caught in heavy traffic, the engine had a propensity to overheat, while the model was also known for its exceptional discomfort due to the unsprung weight of the rear unit that led to near constant rattling and bumping even on a smoothly tarmacked road. The various problems with the Ariel 3 were sadly ignored by the BSA management, who pressed the rushed, half-developed motortrike into public sale due to their belief that people would buy one regardless simply for image purposes, a fact proven wrong when the first sales reports came through the door. While BSA directors and executive staff were notorious for their dislike of the motorbike industry as a whole, with many of whom either having never owned a motorbike, had no knowledge of motorbike design, or were openly ashamed of the fact that they were involved in the motorbike industry at all. Therefore, by December 1969, the British motorcycle industry was facing financial collapse, with a brief being delivered to the then Minister of Technology, Tony Benn, from the Motorcycle and Cycle Industries Association, an organisation that represented virtually all motorcycle and cycle manufacturers in Britain, that provided the industry's explanation for its current predicament. The association would lay blame primarily on the government's lack of support since the end of World War II, that had forced these companies to focus as much of their energies as possible on the export market, while not investing in the domestic market, which was easily swept up by foreign builders once they began to emerge in the early 1960s, while at the same time accusing the government of having stifled their practices through regulations and tax that had smothered consumer interest, in contrast to foreign rivals that had enjoyed the full support of their respective governments. The conclusions of the association were countered by a report penned in 1975 by the Department of Industry, in association with the Boston Consulting Group, or BCG, and entitled Strategy Alternatives for the British Motorcycle Industry, which outlined sharp criticism of the manufacturer's past performance, being more concerned in short-term profitability rather than long-term survival against rising foreign competitors. They also noted how lower investment and antiquated factories, which produced only a fraction of Japanese output, had contributed to the poor state of the British industry, which, in spite of its drastic restructuring and generous government subsidies, only accounted for 20,000 motorcycles built for the 1974-75 fiscal year, as compared to 2 million examples output solely by Honda. At the same time, the British industry had conducted a full-scale retreat from small-engine motorbike models during the early 1960s, due to their misled belief that the Japanese firms would not move into larger motorbikes, essentially cutting out the established base of their company sales output while focusing on fleeting spikes in interest for their larger models such as the Triumph Bonneville. This ultimately led to the British industry, by 1975, not producing a motorbike model with an engine displacement smaller than 500cc, and were now backed firmly against a wall with only 750cc and 850cc classes to sell in a market now saturated by similar Japanese models. The BCG report ultimately concluding that BSA, as the last large-volume motorbike builder in the UK, through its complacence and mismanagement, had been the architect of its own demise, and considered it justified to axe the state subsidies of the Wilson government, which amounted to upward of £24 million since 1973. As production rates for BSA models dropped to their lowest ever figures, with 35,000 BSA, 38,000 Triumph and 10,000 Norton models being produced per annum by the end of 1972, BSA was rendered defunct in 1973, with its former assets being acquired at bankruptcy auction by the Manganese Bronze Holdings Company, while the former Triumph and Norton assets were reorganised into Norton Villiers Triumph, or NVT, by the Wilson government. NVT fared no better than it did under BSA tenure, as with its continued failure to develop models that could match the reliability and performance of the Japanese firms, the tough no-nonsense industry minister Eric Varley, as per his strict line with part-nationalised car builder British Leyland, recalled a loan for £4 million and refused to renew the company's export credits in July 1975, forcing the firm into receivership. This would lead to redundancies being announced for all of the staff at the various sites, with the Wolverhampton plant of the former Sunbeam Company being closed in September of the same year, with 1,600 workers being laid off, followed later that month by the closure of the former BSA plant at Smallheath, though some elements of the factory remained open until February 1976, so as to complete an order for Triumph Trident motorbikes for the Saudi Arabian police force. As for Triumph itself, in 1973, following the formation of NVT, Varley's predecessor, Tony Benn, had proposed the closure of Triumph's home factory at Meriden near Solihull so as to consolidate operations at the BSA plant in Smallheath, with an expected 3,000 of the 4,500 staff at this facility to be made redundant. The Triumph staff responding by staging a 2-year sit-in that halted production of the still iconic Bonneville and sent NVT's finances spiralling into its 1975 collapse. Varley would eventually agree to the creation of the Meriden Motorcycle Cooperative, That, in combination with a substantial government loan, would allow for continued production of the Bonneville at the Meriden factory, which was now the only operational plant left in the NVT arsenal, while Edward Turner was brought out of retirement to design a new 350cc twin model that later saw input from Doug Heel and Bert Hopwood, two of the best motorcycle engineers in British history, but this never went beyond the prototype stage, together with its proposed range of modular engines that would have been crowned with a V5 unit. Eventually, NVT was liquidated in 1978, but the Triumph name continued in circulation as part of the Meriden Motorcycle Cooperative into the 1980s from its Meriden factory, the cooperative having bought the rights to the Triumph mark in 1977, just prior to NVT's final demise, with Triumph still relying on the Bonneville as its main source of income as it continued to sell strongly on the American market until 1979. However, in the wake of the Iranian Revolution and subsequent fuel crisis, the economic upheaval meant the British pound rapidly gained strength over the dollar, meaning UK products were now prohibitively expensive to buy in the United States, and thus saw Bonneville sales plummet, the company's debt standing at £2 million by 1980, alongside a still outstanding sum of £5 million to the government from an earlier loan. However, the newly elected government of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher promptly wrote off £8.4 million owed to the state, but still left the company needing to pay back £2 million to Britain's Export Credits Guarantee Department, Triumph continuing through the early 1980s developing models such as the custom-styled Triumph T140 TSX and 8-valve Triumph T140W TSS model, both of which were released in 1982. Sadly, the latter was notorious for its porous cylinder head, as caused by the poor build of external contractors and a rushed development, which led to the model being a significant sales failure, the loss of which ultimately brought about the end of the cooperative when Triumph Motorcycles Meriden Limited collapsed into bankruptcy on August 23, 1983, wrapping up the last of Britain's renowned motorbike builders that had once been the greatest in the world. Fortunately, in the wake of the cooperative's collapse, John Bloor, chairman of house builder Bloor Homes, bought the rights to the Triumph name and established Triumph Motorcycles Limited during the same year and restarted production of the Bonneville at a small scale through Les Harris of Racing Spares, who built these models under license at his factory in Newton Abbot in Devon, assembling these motorbikes at a rate of 14 new units per week until such time that wider mass production facilities could be established by Bloor. However, due to these units not meeting American safety legislation, the Harris Bonnevilles were not sold in the United States, Bloor opting to follow the track of the Japanese by integrating computer-controlled assembly into the production process so as to allow for the faster and more reliable assembly of models, thus leading, in 1988, to the opening of a brand new Triumph motorbike factory at Hinckley in Leicestershire. This factory covers a 10-acre site, with Bloor injecting between £70 million and £100 million of his own money into the company until it eventually broke even in 2000, while today, outside of Triumph and its huge resurgence onto the global motorbike market, other companies currently in operation include AJS, Ariel, CCM, Cheney, Reeves, Hesketh, Matisse, Wasp, and the revived Norton, which resumed production in 2008. To summarise, the collapse of the British motorbike industry follows a similar vein to that of the wider British car industry, where decades of complacency and bad habits due to the strong position of the industry during the 1950s, together with the merging of various firms into a single large conglomerate, meant these companies were ill-prepared for the rapid expansion of foreign builders during the 1960s and 70s. However, unlike the car industry, which sought to do whatever it could to try and reverse its ever-dwindling fortunes, the motorbike industry was hamstrung by an openly critical management that ensured vital decisions necessary to save its future were either ignored or not fully committed to, thus bringing about the end of the business in 1983.